We have, in this introduction, Heather and Ivo have explained that we come to this from the perspective of the challenges facing humanity today. Ecological challenges, economic challenges, political challenges, social challenges, technological challenges of an unprecedented nature. Unprecedented in terms, never have we faced such a complex of challenges that are all global in nature, which means that our existing attempts to address our problems at the local and national level is clearly increasingly inadequate. Secondly, that are so interwoven and interconnected with each other that no longer are our sectoral or piecemeal approaches to solving problems adequate. They are all increasingly interrelated, and this has been the study of the Academy on what we call the need for a new paradigm. Most of the attention to ecological issues, economic issues, is what should we do differently? What policies should change? What institutional changes are necessary? But at the Academy, we have started with a recognition that the most fundamental change that's necessary is at the conceptual level. That unless we change our understanding of the knowledge on which we are approaching these problems, we're not going to effectively address them. And therefore, it's not enough that our policies and institutions change, but our conceptual framework needs to change. The theories on which we base our policies need to change. And that's really what we mean when we talk about a new paradigm. As Ivo said, education is central to this process. And if the whole world needs new thinking in terms of how we're going to handle our political, economic, social, ecological, and technological and other problems, then it implies that we probably need to really look seriously at how education needs to evolve in future. Heather has already spoken to the quantitative dimension of the challenge and that's before us. And we've spent the last 2 years since the conference we had at Berkeley in October 2013, looking a great deal at the quantitative challenge and how it can be met in the future. This conference, this meeting, and the program that we would like to see come out of this is really focusing on the qualitative dimension. Not qualitative in the sense of which university is rated first on research or such things. Qualitative in terms of the very concept of education, of higher education, how it is practiced, how the paradigm of education can improve and change in future. We talk about it so much. Education is so much a part of our lives that I think we tend to take for granted what this thing is. I would say that of all the inventions, creations of humanity over the last 10,000 years, perhaps after agriculture, because without that we wouldn't be here at all, there's nothing that has had such a profound impact on the evolution of the human race as our invention of this social organization we call education. By education, we take all of the cumulative experience of countless past generations, millennium of human experience, organize it, concentrate it, abridge it, try to understand it, and present it to the next generation in an abridged form so that the next generation can start off based on all the accumulated learning of the past, rather than trying to reinvent not only the wheel, but Pythagoras' theorem, Archimedes' discoveries, and all that has taken place since. Now, our process of learning tends to be, we learn how to do something and we come to understand how we've done it much later. So often a physical success, a social achievement may precede an understanding or a theoretical conception of what worked or didn't work by a long period. And as we go on in education, the question is, how much have we really understood of the cumulative experience of humanity in the past? Not just the facts of it, not just what's happened, what we've done, what we have learned, but how we learn. And how can we improve on that process so that we can give a more effective instrument to future generations? Now, I think we all realize, starting out, that this is an exercise in humility, because this is an exercise that starts on the premise that we're trying to improve on the cumulative learning of humanity up until now. And our job in the next 3 days is to look at how we can do it better than we've done it up until now. We start with a celebration of the fact that we have a great invention, and the fact, as Hater said, that we have extended it fivefold in a few decades, and we'll be doing that much more in future. From here on, we acknowledge the effort, the innovations that have been done and are being done all over the world in universities and colleges and research institutions and by thinkers on this field. Our main goal in the next 3 days is to try to frame the issues, the questions that we think need to be asked further. And some of the ways in which we feel, we've had discussions on this in WAS and in the consortium for the last few years, some of the themes that have developed have come out of our discussions in earlier courses and conferences that we think need to be worked on further. We don't expect to come out of this 3 days with a set of answers or a new paradigm or how things should be done at every level. But it would be very good if we can come out of this 3 days with a clear set of questions and objectives of what we in the academy and the consortium and in our collaborating institutions and partners around the world can do together to work towards a new paradigm. Therefore, we encourage an open discussion. It's not necessary we have all the answers in order to pose the challenging questions. Ivo already spoke to this point, that there's some inherent enigma about education or a paradox, that in one sense, education naturally focuses on all that's happened in the past in order to get and synthesize and pass on the cumulative knowledge of the past. At the same time, the world is moving very quickly. There is an inbuilt conservative tendency simply because we're trying to understand what we've already understood, what we've already learned, or try to understand it better than than so far. So there is a tendency to be looking back. Looking back also can be very progressive and mind-opening, because we recognize at so many points in the past we thought that we knew the answers, and then found out a little later that the answers we had were either not right or were a very limited portion of a wider truth. So studying the past can not only help us learn what we've learned, but it can help us learn how we learn and how we make mistakes, and so that we can more consciously and effectively address the past. If we didn't have education, we probably wouldn't be very much aware of how much things are changing and how fast they're changing. I'm an American living in South India, and I've been there since, well, it's almost 44 years now, and I see the younger generation in India. My staff are all in their mostly late 20s or 30s, latest 40s, and who really, the word green revolution is just a word for them. The idea of Indian independence were, Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru, our names for them. The kids today complain that it's very hot and the air conditioning is not working. But I remember when I went to India 44 years ago, air conditioning was only for the Maharajas and the Prime Minister. And we tend not to be. So education can help us be aware of things were very different. As we all know in this room, Croatia was very different in 1989 when I first visited Yugoslavia. But for those born afterwards, it's a different context. So education has these two dimensions to it. It focuses on the past, but it also can give us a sense of our movement. And of course, much more than that, it can focus on the future. And we have a conference coming up in November in Trento, a conference on the discipline of anticipation, where we really, in fact, Garry Facer, who's here, will be leading some sessions to really talk about what is the relevance of education towards anticipating the future, and how do we do that. So we have this paradox to deal with. But I think there's another way in which time, it's not only a question of what we're looking at in education, but the very process of education has a certain, what I'm calling a time warp or a time drag on it. And this is, of course, a generalized statement, and it's not a fully clear picture, but I think it illustrates a point. Many of the instructors today were educated in a previous generation by instructors who were educated in a generation prior to that. So we're actually talking about, we're trying to educate people today, youth today, for the next generation. So we have potentially at least a 2 or 3 or even 4 generation gap between, in some cases, the knowledge that's being taught and the world in which this knowledge is to be applied. I remember when I first met Janani about 20 years ago, she was just finishing a master's in computer science, and she was using a textbook, if I remember right, published in 1971, where she was learning Fortran and BASIC, which I learned at the university in 1967, and she was learning it in 1996. So this is not a universal truth, but I think there's a reality to it, and in different courses that we need to take into account. But that's only one way. Our instructors are teaching based on a knowledge acquired during a period in which knowledge has changed dramatically. From the time instructors were educated, not only if the knowledge is old, but so I mentioned today, many of our today's instructors were educated before the end of the Cold War, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the founding of the EU, the creation of the Internet, robotics, artificial intelligence, analysis of the human genome. And at the same time, we have another time-distorting element, and that is the content of knowledge is changing so rapidly that even what is taught today, even if the instructors and the educational curriculum were to have the latest knowledge, the question is how relevant will that knowledge be to what youth will need and what the world needs in future, which is the topic of the New Paradigm Project, because we're not looking at the historical knowledge, we're trying to say where is our knowledge today and how adequate or inadequate it is for the future. Today, what is being taught in MBA courses about the role of financial markets, about computerization, about the globalization of finance and high-frequency trading? How relevant will our theories today and our practices today to the world of 2020 or 2025? So I think if you take it as a generalization, which is only partly true, still it reflects a profound challenge that we have. It's not a criticism, it's an inherent challenge in what should we be teaching today to equip youth for the future? And is there a way we can do it better? And this is a main question before us. At the same time, society is not keeping quiet. Society is rapidly changing. Technology is changing. We all talk about the quantum leap in information, the speed and the multiplication with which information is being generated, and whether that's really data. Sometimes we call it data, sometimes we call it information, sometimes we call it knowledge. A lot of it is simply data, but there is certainly a lot more information available to all of us today. At the same time, our technologies for the dissemination of information, for access to that information, have changed so radically. So it raises the quantum of information raises a basic question. And what I want to do is raise questions for our discussion in the rest of this course is, if information is multiplying so quickly, just how much information can the human mind absorb? And I think more importantly than that is, how much should it absorb? Working for a long time in India, where memorization has been and remains the primary instrument of education, and people have developed a prodigious memory. But when all your energy is going into memorizing facts to reproduce on an exam, how much mental energy is left to be thinking about the facts, to be analyzing the facts, to be thinking beyond the facts? So it's not just a question of how much capacity we have, but what faculties should we be using, and how much, and what are the implications of emphasizing one faculty at the expense of others? We're using a basic technology for the dissemination of information, which precedes the invention of the printing press, the newspaper, the radio, the television, and the internet. It's an exaggeration, of course, because higher education at all levels are using many advanced technologies. But the basic core delivery system, which we still talk about as the model for higher education, come to a lecture and interact with faculty, is essentially from the time of the founding of the University of Bologna. It has certainly not changed the way most of the fields of our human existence have changed, the way we communicate, the way we move around, the way we produce things, the way we interact with each other, our concepts of money. At that time, money meant gold coins. There wasn't even paper currency. So there certainly is, and now we see an attempt to try to close this gap and see how we can use the latest technologies to alter and improve the educational delivery. Recently, as Hater mentioned, we've seen an enormous quantitative expansion in both the demand for education and the supply. We've seen a major increase in the quantum of information being incorporated into the academic curriculum. We've seen a multiplication and, by necessity, a fragmentation of disciplines into more and more specialized compartments, and an increasing shift from general knowledge to discipline-specific expertise. We had a conference in Baku in end of April, and one of our fellows, Roberto Poli, who's organizing the conference on anticipation, one of his comments was, we seem to have lost the capacity to educate generalists. Our education is increasingly the education of people with a very narrower and narrower discipline-specific expertise, something that I believe Alberto will talk to in his presentation, because he's got great experience to illustrate the problem that it represents. So I think we all know this, but just to put some facts before you and to our online audience, this graph shows the growth in the number of disciplines in the broadest sense over the last couple of centuries. And if you go a little further in breaking it down, in the discipline of history alone, this is from the one university in the United States, and it's not, I couldn't fit it all on one slide. It multiplies out into many more than this. If you look at new subjects created at one university in the U.S. since 1970, and this may not be an exhaustive list. Where are we today? Starting the 21st century, we've got 1,000, if you take disciplines and subdisciplines, it comes to about 1,000 different subjects. In biology alone, there are 63. In medicine, there are 24 sciences, 120 subspecialties. In psychology, 22 specialties. So every field is different. But I think if we're training people more and more for these specific narrow disciplines, it definitely has an impact on our capacity to address social issues, and it's a recurring theme we'll be discussing. We can ask ourselves what's wrong with the compartmentalization and specialization of knowledge. In fact, it's one of the greatest inventions we've ever had. We're going to have a discussion on the nature of mind and how mind thinks. And our capacity to concentrate on a part, zoom in on it, and look at it in closer and closer detail is one of the principal ways in which knowledge has expanded over the last few thousand years. We need, in order to really become, to learn all there is to learn about the genetics of DNA and inheritance and so forth, we need to be able to specialize and zoom down more and more. But at the same time, the more we tend to focus on the part, the more difficult it is to keep perspective of the whole and the interconnections. And in our work for the new paradigm, we've come to the conclusion that this is a fundamental source of the problems we have today. And since economics is a core issue, and we have spent a lot of time on it, I just give this as an example. We've got financial markets today that really function almost independently of the real economy for which they were originally established to support the development of the real economy. Ivo and I were discussing yesterday, just in the last 15 years, 2 Nobel Prizes were awarded for economists who developed high-frequency trading algorithms, which were the fundamental source for the economic instability that we've seen in 2008 and we still see today. The difficulty of specialization is that in developing a specialized expertise, we have the danger of more and more losing knowledge of the impact on the whole. Of course, many of the challenges we face today because of ecology can be traced back to the fact that economics never considered ecology as part of the subject matter until the time of Club of Rome's report and other the development of the environmental industry field, which told us not only that our practices are wrong, but our very concepts are wrong, are inadequate, are too narrowly focused. So what should we be teaching? And that's a question that we'll come back to, and that's a question which faces every faculty member in every university in every subject today. How much and what selection of what we teach should be facts? Simple facts and raw data. In economics, what is GDP? How is it calculated? What is the percentage of financial services? How the service sector is increasingly generating a larger proportion of GDP in the past? What is a derivative? And so on and so on. An endless number of facts to be understood. And then there's information, and I'm saying when you relate facts together, you get something that's more than the fact. You see relationships with the facts. And a date is just a fact, but when you relate the fact that the birth of the Internet and the end of the Cold War were very closely related to one another, then you wonder, is there a relationship between them? This is an information, two facts which appear to be unrelated. And what would have happened? Would we have had an internet if we still had the Cold War and the Iron Curtain today? Could we have ever imagined this free exchange of information all over the globe and the kind of communication we have today? We know all economic students are learning about GDP, but what about the fact that GDP includes not just positive contributions to the welfare of society and raising production, but environmental catastrophes are raising GDP, our expenditure on military and war are raising GDP. By understanding what GDP is, we don't understand all there is about it. GDP doesn't include the non-monetarized sector, the fact that so many people, especially women, but not only, who are providing services, essential services for the survival of and growth and development of humanity, but are not reflected in GDP. So the reality is much more complex. And if we go from beyond information and to thought, and just what I mean by that is the capacity to take pieces of information and correlate them and analyze them and examine them. For example, a thought that has been voiced very frequently in recent times: what's the relationship between economic growth and human welfare? Still, the politicians largely and the people largely, if they tell, oh, our GDP is going up, that's great. Our GDP is going down, that's bad. Is it bad if the GDP from speculative financial exchanges goes down? If it's bad that the GDP from military expenditure goes down? The reality is much more complex than just having a fact or a piece of information. And then beyond the thoughts, what happens when we take two or more thoughts and try to relate them together and see the relationship between them? What is the relationship between economic development and ecological sustainability? A question that is now being voiced. As if it's a new question, as if it's something we've just discovered. But how far does that form part of the economics curriculum around the world today? Not just what Jeffrey Sachs is teaching and saying, we don't need growth, we only need sustainability. But how far has it percolated down into our educational system? What is the relationship between the individual and the collective? And how does the relationship between individual freedom and collective responsibility or collective harmony express in the field of economics and in the theories and practices of economics we're teaching? How much are our students presented with the fact there are fundamental issues related to human beings that are reflecting in our financial markets, in our economic system today? A theme that Winston, who will join us a little later and speak in the afternoon, we developed in our course last year. What precisely is the relationship between the economy and political power or social power? What is the role of corporate money or wealth in influencing democracy? Do we really have democracy today in my country? Is it really democracy, or is it something closer to plutocracy? What is, in reverse, what is the impact of the political system on economy? Can we really have what we call a market economy in the absence of an effective political system? Will we really have a competitive market economy without regulation? So these are more fundamental issues than what is GDP. And finally, what about values? What is the role of values in education? With what values should we be teaching? With what values should we be discussing? Whatever the subject is. Our fellow board member and founder of Cadmus, Oreo Giarini, keeps stressing the fact that Adam Smith, who's credited with being the father of economics, did not consider himself an economist at all. He considered himself a moral philosopher. His goal was not to say that markets are the be-all and end-all and answer to everything. His goal was to say we have to attune our economy in a way that maximizes human welfare. And the old mercantile system in which a few wealthy traders were in collaboration or with the crown is not the best way to promote human welfare and the benefits of society. So what are the values that our system, our ideas, our theories are serving? The value of freedom, the value of equality, the value of social harmony and sustainability and so forth. So I've given the example from economics, but I think the principle is true for every field, including the natural sciences, and maybe you'll have time to pursue it later and discuss it. But there are complex decisions to be made. What should we be teaching, at what level, how much, and in what context? And I think as you go down this list, you see we go from the narrow specific to the broader general, which eventually integrates with our conception of human life on Earth in its totality. So it raises other questions. What faculties should we be developing? And how much effort and how do we develop each of these faculties? Memorization, observation, multisensory capacities we all learn through different ways best. How much should our education be reflecting those individual differences? Communication skills, interpersonal skills, analytic, reductive thinking to focus on the part, comprehensive, holistic thinking to see the parts in relationship to one another. And how do we do that? That's another topic for discussion. How do we integrate knowledge from different levels and different fields into something that we could call synthetic or integrated? And I will come back to this in the topic on mind. How do we really foster independent thinking and not just competence in telling back the answers that have been the students have been given? How do we develop imagination, multiple intelligence? And going beyond the mind itself, how does education develop the whole personality? And how much emphasis should be done on it? Obviously, these are very challenging questions. And that's why I said, we know we're not going to come out with all the answers. But I think our discussion in the next 3 days on a very interesting range of presentations, topics and presentations, will help us formulate an agenda for our further work and for our collaboration with others and learning from others, so that over time we can evolve in collaboration with universities better answers or new formulations of how we address these issues. I included at the end a couple of quotes from Whitehead's famous book, The Aims of Education, because they really, things that really struck home to me. And this was one maybe that touched me the most. There's only one subject matter for education. That is life in all its manifestations. What does it mean itself is a good topic for a 3-day course. What is life? And what are all its manifestations? And how is life the subject matter? And how do we learn about life? But I think this is probably the one thing we're talking about. There is no discipline of life. There are no courses on life. And if he says this is the one subject matter, then we can at least ask in each subject that we're teaching, each of these disciplines and 1,000 sub-disciplines, how much does it really relate to life, whatever that means. Whitehead also said, the only use of knowledge of the past is to equip us for the present. It's interesting he didn't say the future here. To equip us for the present. Can we meet the test? First of all, we may not agree with the statement. It's a controversial, provocative statement. But assuming it's true, to what extent does our knowledge of the past equip us for the present? My own conclusion is that everything we've learned and happened in the past is valuable. But that doesn't mean we've discovered its value and relevance for the present. So it's one thing to teach about the past and say we know it's all valuable. It's another to teach it in a way that it really helps us reflect on what its relevance is to our lives in the future. And then he's made a complementary statement saying the present holds within itself the complete sum of existence, backwards and forwards, the whole amplitude of time, which is eternity, which implies, one, that all the present achievements we have and all the present problems we have are reflections of what's happened in the past. And if we've got problems today, it's because of the way we have dealt with things in the past, and there's a lot to learn from that. If we have achievements today, and we certainly have humanity has enormous accomplishments, then there's something about these present things we're so proud of that is a reflection of the past. And again, in the future. All that we're going to do in future, all the things we're going to learn, start here. All of the problems we're going to have are there, at least in essence, here. What Club of Rome saw 45 years ago at what we're facing today, that nobody had heard of climate change at that time. But the essential perception of, look, we've got two things that are disconnected that need to be connected, it was shown. So how can we can only really educate in the present because we don't know about the future. But how do we educate in the present to take full advantage of the cumulative learning of the past to most effectively prepare us for the future? So what would be, and this is a question, what would be a new paradigm in education? What are the dimensions of it that we're going to explore in the next 3 days and work on over the coming years? In a summary fashion, this is from our earlier discussions and writings and all, I've identified 9 characteristics of the qualitative dimension of education. These are generalizations, but this is a kind of a characterization of the system as it exists today, with all the exceptions that may be there. It tends to still be information-based, compartmentalized, abstracted, detached, aloof. It depends on the department, it depends on the university, but anyway, I think we all agree there's a big gap between the educational system and the social reality of which it's trying to relate. It's divided in discipline-specific ways. It tends to be, we tend to still be dominated, and we'll come back to it later on, by a mechanistic, even our social sciences are largely influenced by the mechanistic discoveries in the natural sciences in previous centuries. Even our business management tends to focus more on how processes are done than human beings behave, would be an example of that. It tends to be more analytical than synthetic. And this is another paradigm specific. We learn different paradigms in education, whether it's in mathematics or economics or anything, but we tend not to learn about the process of moving from one paradigm to another, or to be conscious of the fact that we're in a different paradigm, and to be conscious of the implicit assumptions behind it, which would help us see how do we go beyond those paradigms. It tends to be subject-centered, and it tends to be oriented towards preparing us for something we call a profession or a career. What will it be in future? Our discussions up until now have suggested a direction for that, that there'll be a greater shift from information to ideas, from compartmentalization to context, from the abstract to the life-centric and value-based, from discipline-specific to transdisciplinary. We had a whole course on it last September. From mechanistic to organic, analytic to creative, paradigm-specific to multi-paradigmatic, in which we'll be conscious of the fact that we're mixing paradigms, we're speaking from different paradigms, we understand that, we're not just disagreeing with one another, but we're looking from different conceptual frameworks at the same reality. That the subject, the person, will really be the aim of education, not any particular subject matter. How well are we preparing people, developing people for their life? And rather than just relating to a person as we're educating an engineer or a doctor, we're developing an individual. We're helping an individual discover themselves and their personality. So I think you'll agree there's enough scope for our discussion and controversy and new thinking on these issues.